Hello, students, and today we will discuss exposures and vulnerability. At the end of this module, you should be able to explain the meaning of vulnerability, explain why certain sectors of society are more vulnerable to disaster than others, recognize vulnerabilities of different elements exposed to specific standards, and differentiate among hazards, exposure, and vulnerabilities and give examples from actual situation. In Module 1, we have introduced the following definition of a hazards as a dangerous phenomenon substance, human activity or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. This event has a probability of occurrence within a specified period of time and within a given area and has a given intensity. Our figure represents understanding hazards, exposures, and vulnerability. So that is our topic for today, hazards and risk. These hazardous events may be potentially harmful to people, property, infrastructure, economy, and activities, but also to the environment, which are all grouped together under the term elements at risk or assets. Also, the term exposure is used to indicate those elements at risk that are subject to potential losses. Important elements at risk that should be considered in analyzing potential damage of hazards are population, building stock, essential facilities, and critical infrastructure. So this explains that assets or elements at risk is a generic term that signifies everything that might be exposed to hazards, ranging from buildings to the economy and from individual persons to communities. It is because of the interference with things we care about that we consider hazards as problems. Exposure, on the other hand, is defined as the situation of people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard prone areas. As stated in the United Nations glossary, measures of exposure can include the number of people or type of assets in an area. This can be combined with a specific vulnerability and the capacity of the exposed elements to any particular hazard to estimate the quantitative risk associated with that hazard in the area of interest. Critical infrastructure consists of the primary physical structures, technical facilities, and systems which are socially, economically, or operationally essential to the functioning of the society or community, both in routine circumstances and in the extreme circumstances of an emergency. Elements at risk have a certain level of vulnerability, which can be defined in a number of different ways. The general definition is that vulnerability describes the characteristics and circumstances of a community, systems, or assets that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. So, in our two images, the above image represents the new development areas of residential houses which are designed using flood-proof materials or minimum flood floor heights na kadalasan nasa 10 feet para siguradong makaligtas sa mataas na pagbaha. Therefore, it makes the buildings more resilient to floods. Ang ibig sabihin ng resilient na word or term ay nangangahulugang matatag ang bahay mo sa mga dadating na pagbaha. Dagdag pa dito na dapat sundin ang Philippine National Building Code na siyang magiging batayan sa pagpapatayo ng mga flood resilient at earthquake resilient na mga gusali, gaya ng mga bahay at commercial establishment. Makakatulong din ang zoning setbacks as you can see in our image at panganahing alituntunin nito ay to keep the buildings away from more hazardous areas. Ibig sabihin, merong sukat or safe na measurement kapag nagpatayo ka ng bahay. Dapat hindi siya prone to hazard. Land filling of low-lying areas ay ang mga pamamaraan na kung saan ang mababang lokasyon ng lupa kung saan ipapatayo ang isang bahay o gusali ay kailangang dagdagan pa ng lupa para tumaas ang kinatatayuan nito upang limitahan ang sakuna kagaya ng mataas na pagbaha. Ang nasa babang larawan naman ay may mga naitayong levees. Ano ba ang levees? Isa siyang harang. Levees sa pagitan ng dalawang bahay. Ang levees ay isang uri ng river flood protection. Ibig sabihin, harang siya sa baha na nagsisilbing harang sa rumaragasang tubig dulot ng matinding pagbaha. Some existing buildings can also be raised above the flood levels or built using flood-resistant material para mabawasan ang pinsala ng pagbaha. Next, there are many aspects of vulnerability related to physical, social, economic, and environmental conditions. For example, when considering physical vulnerability, only it can be defined as a degree of damage to an object. Example, building exposed to a given level of hazard intensity. Example, water, height, ground shaking, impact, pressure. Okay, so for our example, for a building, in terms of physical vulnerability, isa pang halimbawa sa physical vulnerability niya ay nakadepende rin sa mga natural forces na mararamdaman natin sa paligid o sa environment natin, kagaya ng confined stresses sa lupa na magriresulta sa pagguho ng lupa kasama ang pagkaguho rin ng isang gusali or bahay na nakatayo dun sa lupa na may confined stress. Ang pagguho ng isang ring gusali o ang paggalaw or pagyanig ng lupa ay kadalasan naramdaman natin pag merong earthquake, ay isa ring vulnerable factor sa pagkasira ng isang building dahil sa earthquake intensity na tinatawag. Dahil ang pundasyon ng lupa sa building na tinitirikan mo ay mahina at malapit sa dalawang bitak ng lupa o tinatawag nating fault lines. Risk. Risk is defined as the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses. Example, deaths, injuries, property, livelihoods, economic activity disrupted, or environment damage, resulting from interaction between a natural or human-induced hazards and vulnerable conditions. So, ang risk class ang tawag sa mga maaring sitwasyon nangyari bunga ng mga peligro or hazard na gawa ng tao o natural na sakuna na nangyayari. So, ito ay maaring magbunga ng iba't ibang uri ng expected losses kagaya ng death, injury, property damage, livelihood, economic activity at mga gawaing makakasira sa kalikasan. Vulnerability. Isang bright understanding. Vulnerability is the inability to resist a hazard or respond when disaster has occurred. For instance, people who live on plains are more vulnerable to floods than people who live higher up. Okay, that makes sense, di ba? Ang nasa larawan natin, yung image natin sa slide. Ang nasa larawan ay isa pang halimbawa na ang mga bagay na malapit sa bangin or ang mga bahay na malapit sa bangin tulad ng nakita natin sa image natin, ang malaking bato dyan na nasa taas ng bundok ay maaaring maging isang potential na hazard kapag magkaroon ng landslide o lindol na maging sanhi ng paggalaw nito pababa na magdudulot ng malaking aksidente o pinsala sa mga bahay na malapit sa lokasyon nito. Ang isang bahay naman na may kalayuan na nakikita nyo dyan sa image natin, na may kalayuan sa paanan ng bundok, ay magkakaroon ng low exposure sa isang trahedya na mangyayari o sakuna. Ngunit kailangan din na sumunod pa rin sila sa National Building Code para mabawasan na rin ang pinsala ng landslide at earthquake na maaring tatama sa lugar na iyan. Okay, so this hazard, vulnerability, exposure are all connected from risk. So in our image, risk is a concept which describes a potential set of consequences that may arise from a given set of circumstances. So depende yan sa situation, no? Or sa sakuna na mangyayari. So risk is a combination of the interaction of hazard, exposures, and vulnerability. So yung hazard class, exposure, at vulnerability, magkasama yan palagi, yung tatlo na yan, para makonect natin yung risk na tinatawag. Magkakaroon lang ng risk pag merong hazard, merong exposure, at merong vulnerability, which can be represented by the three overlapping circles, as we can see in our image. Next, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or IFRC. Yung nakita yung image dyan ng cross at yung crescent, no? Ng buwan. Yan yung tinatawag nating International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. It also defines vulnerability as diminished capacity of an individual or group to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from impact of a natural or man-made hazard. Meanwhile, according to United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, vulnerability is the characteristic and circumstances of a community system or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effect of hazards. Next, vulnerability is situation specific. If earthquakes are frequent in a particular region, it does not mean that all the provinces in that region are vulnerable. The vulnerability of the province differs in a way they prepare for the hazard and amount and type of resources they have to prevent and manage it. Okay, so this explains that physical, economic, and social and political factors determine people's level of vulnerability and the extent of their capacity to resist and cope with and recover from hazards. Clearly, poverty is a major contributor of vulnerability. For example, if a specific province has lack of financial assistance in preparedness for disaster, dahil nga nasa poverty category ang kanilang lugar, then the level of vulnerability is in a given situation is specific only for that particular area. Vulnerability is also hard specific. Anong ibig sabihin nito? This means that a community that is vulnerable to earthquakes does not necessarily mean that it is also
vulnerable to typhoons. Again, hazards have different characteristics that influence the disasters that are likely to generate. So for example, ang lugar ng Palawan ay high risk pagdating sa storm surge. Pero according naman sa Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology o PBOX, ang Palawan provinces ay may ituturing na ligtas na lugar kapag magkaroon naman ng ground shaking o tinatawag nating earthquake o lindol. Dahil kabilang ang Palawan sa mga stable region. Ibig sabihin ng stable region, magkalindol man sa Visayas ay wala kang mararamdamang lindol sa Palawan. Ang 10 kilometro or 100 kilometers na East Valley Fault at 100 kilometro o 100 kilometers na West Valley Fault na malapit din dito ay hindi rin makakaapekto sa mga probinsya ng Palawan kapag magkaroon man ng matinding pagyanig dito. That is, vulnerability is also hard specific. Next, in actual fact, vulnerability depends on several factors such as people's age and state of health, local environmental and sanitary conditions, as well as on the quality and state of local buildings and their location with respect to any hazards. Okay, so this explains that natural disasters as the greatest challenges for human societies affect millions of people every year around the world. In this case, older adults are among the most vulnerable groups to immediate impact of natural disasters. Yung mga older natin or elders. Several studies have found that physical well-being of older adults is more affected by natural disasters. They are more vulnerable because of decrease of sensory awareness, physical impairment, chronic medical conditions, and socioeconomic limitation experienced by many of the elderly. And on the other hand, those very young at very young age, yung mga sanggol or yung mga 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, those belongs to also to a vulnerable group, no? Dahil napakabata nila, minsan pag nagkakasakit sila, madalas na hospital at minsan yung iba sa kanila nagkakaroon ng infection, yung katulad sa mga sanggol, at namamatay. So vulnerable din sila. So poor governance from the local government are one of the factors because it will lead to slow distribution of medical support and relief goods. Kagaya din ng nangyayari ngayon sa government natin o sa bansa natin, di ba? Nung nagkaroon tayo ng pandemic COVID, no? Minsan nagkukulang din ng mga medical assistance, relief goods, or kahit nga yung ayuda ay hindi na-distribute ng tama ng gobyerno natin. Okay? Next. Families with low incomes often live in high-risk areas around cities because they can't afford to live in safer and more expensive places. This is very true. This is what we call economic vulnerability. Similarly, a wooden house is sometimes less likely to collapse in an earthquake, but it may be more vulnerable in the event of a fire or a hurricane. This is what we call physical vulnerability. Okay. Halimbawa, or katulad ng mga bahay na nakalutang sa ilog, ay may potential risk din or vulnerable sila na pwedeng tangayin ng rumaragasang pagbaha, katulad ng mga residenteng nakatira mismo sa Aklan River, no? Ay kailangan ng paghahanda at maagang paglikas para makaiwas sa matinding pagbaha. Halimbawa, nag-overflow dun sa Libakaw. So, saan mapupunta yung large amount ng water or ng flood? Siyempre, dun sa mababang level ng lupa. Dun mismo sa Aklan River. So, delikado rin sa mga malalapit na mga kabahayan dun at sa mga tao dun na magstay. So, dapat mag-evacuate agad sila. So, they have the capacity to move or to evacuate. Pero, wala silang choice in terms of economic vulnerability kasi they belong to poor families at yung paraan lang nila ng pagpapatayo ng bahay ay yung available area lang nila ay dun lang talaga sa Aklan River kasi mahirap lang sila. So, families with low incomes often live in high-risk areas around cities. So, yan yung nangyari sa reality o sa realidad ng buhay. Next. There are various factors that must be considered to assess the level of vulnerability of an area or community. These factors affect one another. It can lead to other factors. We have proximity to hazard event. Okay? By the word proximity to hazard event, meaning that signifies the location of a certain community with the by means of hazard event. Okay? So for example, proximity to hazard can be perceived as a potential risk depends on the location of an infrastructures or residential houses, as you can see in our image, that can be included as a potential risk in any hazardous events. So yung nakikita nating mga gusali or may yung mga bahay, no, na malapit dito sa valley na to or bundok na nakakalbo na. At kapag nagkaroon ng malakihang deforestation, wala nang mag-hold sa soil natin or sa mga lupa dyan sa bundok na yun. So magkakaroon ng pagguho o landslide na tinatawag. So obviously, yung mga malalapit na gusali, infrastructures, mga houses, they are near from risk or vulnerable. Yung proximity to hazard nila ay napakataas. Okay? As you can see in our image, the houses or buildings beneath a cliff or hills have a large amount of proximity to hazards. If certain landslides will happen compared to other infrastructures that are far from landslides. So ano yung dapat gawin ng community? So dapat stop nila yung pagmimina na tinatawag, yung deforestation, yung illegal logging. Stop nila yan para maiwasan nila yung landslide. Next, population density near a hazard event. Population density refers to the number of individuals living in an area in relation to the size of that area. Okay, halimbawa, for example, the fire disaster that happened in Sila Serna Street, Calibo last November 2009 around 2 p.m. The fire hits and razed more than 4,000 houses in Barangay Poblacion, Calibo, Aklan. The population density near a hazard event was very clear as one of the major reasons kung bakit mabilis na kumalat ang apoy. Dahil ang sunog daw ay nagsimula sa partikular na lugar na magkakadikit ang mga bahay, ang mga tao, no? That is pertaining to population density. At dahil dyan, dagdag pa na nangyari ang sunog sa oras na napakainit ang sikat ng araw, mga alas 2 ng hapon, na nagresulta sa pagkasunog ng mga kabahayan na yari sa light materials or flammable materials na tinatawag. So 2,000 tao ang nawalan ng bahay. So Fire Inspector Patricio Collado said that the fire started on Sila Serna Street around 2 p.m. and quickly spread in the squatters area colony. So that is a bright example of population density near a hazard event.
Next.
Capacity and efficiency to reduce disaster risk. Capacity or the lack of it is central to reducing disaster risk and therefore critical to meeting development objectives. So very very important or very very significant yung capacity and efficiency to reduce disaster risk. So disaster risk reduction requires an all of society engagement and partnership. So dapat united yung society in partnership with the community or with the government. It also requires empowerment and inclusive, accessible, and non-discriminatory participation. Ibig sabihin, kahit mahirap ka lang, no? Dapat walang mahirap sa sakuna. Dapat lahat tinutulungan. Okay? Mayaman ka man o mahirap. That is non-discriminatory participation. Okay? For example, the Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment na tinatawag o VCA uses various participatory tools to gauge people's exposure to and capacity to resist natural hazard. It is an integral part of disasters preparedness and contributes to the creation of community-based disaster preparedness programs at the rural and urban grassroots level. In addition, for this, DRR or disaster readiness reduction is a part of sustainable development, so it must be involved every part of society. Government, non-governmental organization, the professional and private sector. It therefore requires a people-centered and multi-sector approach, building resilience to multiple, cascading and interacting hazards, and creating a culture of prevention and resilience. That makes sense, no? Pag lahat nagtutulungan, nagkakaisa, magagawa natin at malulutas natin kahit gaano pa kalala yung isang sakuna or yung isang kalamidad.
Building codes and disaster policies.
So building codes is very important. Building codes are regulation governing the design, construction, alteration, maintenance of structures. Ibig sabihin, pag nagpatayo ka ng bahay mo, you should follow these building codes. Lalong-lalo na pag yung bahay mo ay malaki, no? Halimbawa, malaki yung gagawin mong bahay at alam ng government na magbabayad ka ng malaking buwis. So, in that sense, no, kailangan mo ng engineer or architect na gagawa sa bahay mo or sa residential houses na ipapatayo mo. Kasama na dun yung lupa. So, pag yung engineer yung gumawa, ibig sabihin, susunod siya sa building codes. That is necessary or kailangan niyang gawin yan. Kasi engineer siya. Pero, at some point of practicality, karamihan sa bahay na ginagawa ng mga middle class na tinatawag ay hindi sila sumusunod sa building codes. Kasi pag sumunod sila sa building codes, medyo maawat kanda, no? Pag process 8 papers sa pagpapagawa ng bahay. Kaya iilan lang sa mga buildings dito sa Pilipinas ang nagfa-follow ng building codes. So these codes specify the minimum requirements to safeguard the health, safety, and welfare of the building occupants. Okay, so mas ligtas yung bahay na sumusunod sa building codes kasi they have those requirements to safeguard the health, no, safety, and welfare of the building occupants. They are enforced to make buildings safer to withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters. So, yan yung advantage pag yung bahay mo ay may building codes as regulation by government design. No? Kasi you are ensured that your house can withstand earthquake and other natural disaster. Makikita mo din yan sa sa mga plano na ipapakita sa'yo ng mga architect or yung mga engineer. So how are these building codes enforced? So local government building officials are the ones who enforce building codes. They review design plans, inspect construction work, and issue permit. So sila yung nag-issue ng tinatawag nating building permit. Building officials come out to the site for inspections at different phases in the architecture project to ensure the building is being built according to the code. Yan, naka-base siya sa building code ng Pilipinas para mas maging safe siya at matibay siya sa mga lindol, sa mga flood, no, pagbaha at iba pang kalamidad. So, ano ba yung building official na to? The building official is a government official and a person responsible for carrying out the provisions of the building code. He must be a licensed architect that has a full knowledge in building construction. In his respective territorial jurisdiction, the building official shall be primarily responsible for the enforcement of the provisions of the building code, as well as of the implementing rules and regulation issued therefore. He is the official charged with the duties of issuing building permits, no? As I've said kanina, no? And the performance times, reasonable times to inspect and determine compliance with the requirement upon the building code, and the terms and conditions provided for in the building permit as issued. When any building work is found to be contrary to the provision of this code, halimbawa yung building work mo ay hindi sumusunod or lumabag sa provision or sa rules ng National Building Code ng Pilipinas, the building official may order the work stop and prescribe the terms and or conditions when the work will be allowed to resume. So, aayusin niya yun. Ipapatigil muna niya yung construction ng bahay mo and then aayusin niya yung mga hindi nasunod sa building code ng Pilipinas para ma-resume ulit or magpatuloy ulit yung construction. Likewise, the building official is authorized to order the discontinuance of the occupancy or use of any building or structure or portion thereof found to be occupied or used contrary to the provision of this code. So here is a list of the different phases when a building official will come out for inspection. So, inspect niya yung foundation ng bahay, yung rough framing, yung complete rough plumbing and electrical insulation, drywall, final inspection, and certificate of occupancy. Okay? So, dito muna tayo sa pag-inspection ng pundasyon ng bahay or yung foundation. Okay? So, the foundation of a building, as you can see in our image, of any residential houses or any building or any establishment must be equipped and designed in a safetiest way. Kailangan maayos yung pagkakagawa niyan at matibay that can withstand the force of earthquake and any type of soil foundation movement. Okay? So nagkakaroon din ng test sa soil foundation. Ibig sabihin, magre-require din tayo ng surveyor at yung tinatawag nating geotechnical engineering or yung mga geotechnical engineers, no? Na magte-test sa resilience ng isang lupa na pagtatayuan ng gusali or ng establishment. It must follow also the building code description in designing a foundation with the use of earthquake resistance for building na itinuro ko nung nakaraang module 1 natin. Like designing a floating foundation and caisson foundation. Okay? So, kagaya lang ng ginawa ng bansang Japan sa building specification nila na in-improve nila yon at in-apply nila yung mga earthquake resistance for building. So, yan yung pagbabago sa building code ng Japan. Next, we have the rough framing. So, for construction specialists work on rough framing to turn blueprints into the sturdy internal structure. So, yung rough framing na yan, nakalagay yan sa mga blueprint ng mga architect. And that will apply later on in real situations of construction. For most homes, construction framers measure, cut, and assemble lumber for the walls and subfloor, adding anchors and other vital structural support. As you can see in our right image, no? May mga support siya, mga anchors o mga bolted connection para mas matibay yung mga framing ng bahay, yung mga structural frame, yung mga framing ng mga bakal at iba pang galvanized iron na tinatawag. Yung mga tinatawag nating bracing, no, ng bahay, napaka-importanteng maging matibay sa pagpapatayo ng isang gusali or ng isang establishment, whether it is commercial or private establishment. Okay? It must also follow the building code description in designing a foundation with the use of earthquake resistance for building, like designing a floating foundation and caisson foundation. Okay? So, the structural supports ensure that the internal framing of the whole body of the building or a house can withstand the force of earthquake. Hindi lang earthquake, kundi pati na rin yung typhoon, yung floods, yung storm surge, and other forces of nature. So these rough framings are properly checked by the building official later on. Next, as in the case with plumbing, pag sinabi natin plumbing, yan yung pag dito lang sa community natin, sa local, pag plumber ka, natawag kang tubero, pero hindi yon, mali yon. Pag plumbing, you are skilled, no? You are a skilled worker. You have the knowledge in plumbing installation, yung mga tubo, mga waterways na yan, mga water outlet, yung dinadaanan ng mga sources of water natin. Ikaw yung responsible dyan. Yung tinatawag na plumbing design. It is very important that wall studs or other structural members that are cut away to sustain substantially be either replaced or appropriately repaired. So, dapat nasa ayos yung mga paggawa mo ng mga connection ng mga waterways na yan just to ensure na hindi magkakaroon ng leakage. Okay? Pag magkaroon ng leakage, pwede magkaroon ng diseases kasi may leakage yung mga tubo. Cabling that's run outside the walls will need to be appropriately shielded likewise. It is important that the electrician, so dito naman tayo sa electrical installation. The electrician knows exactly where everything's supposed to go and the exact specification for whatever's being installed so that there's less room for error or confusion. So yung mga electrician natin na yan, they are licensed, no? Electrician, licensed engineer, electrical engineer, or pwede rin na may title sila of national competencies na tinatawag or yung NC3. So the precise location of the electrical fittings will often be marked on the floor so that they can be easily located and cut. As you can see in our image, cut out the plasterboard goes up for your home's interior walls. So the appropriate installation of plumbing and electrical layout will ensure that the building is safe. Okay, tandaan yan. And resilient to any kind of disaster. Therefore, it will be past the guidelines of the National Building Code. Next, we have building insulation or insulation. Kapag gusto natin yung bahay na medyo makakaramdam tayo ng comfortment, no? Or kumbaga, komportable tayo sa bahay kasi hindi siya mainit. Kailangan natin ng mga insulation frames or insulation material na ilalagay natin sa mga ceiling natin. Yan, as you can see in our image. So building insulations is any object in a building use an insulation for any purpose. So pwedeng insulation siya sa heat ng sun or ng sunlight, sa sikat ng araw, or pwede ring insulation siya sa sunog, no, or fireproof. So while the majority of insulation in building is for thermal purposes, yung sinabi ko kanina, insulation siya sa init ng sa init ng araw or sa sikat ng araw, and then pwede na siya maging protection sa sunog. The term also applies to acoustic insulation, fire insulation, and impact insulation. Meron ding mga bahay na ginagamitan natin ng insulation for a noise disturbance. May mga soundproof tayong mga rooms, no? Yan yung mga bagong design ng mga architect. Next, we have the drywall. Ano ang tinatawag na drywall class? A drywall is a fire resistant due to gypsum which will prevent the fire from spreading. So yung gypsum ay isang element na hinahalo sa drywall, no? Kumbaga, plastered siya or parang plywood siya class na may gypsum element or fire resistant. So, yung kaibahan lang nito sa insulation, siya ay isang board plate, no? As you can see in our figure. That is board plate. Dinikit natin, makakabuo ka ng wall. Tinatawag siyang drywall kasi fire resistant siya. Drywall can be used for the construction of regular walls and also ceilings, no? Mga sakiksame. Pwede din siyang idikit doon, but also as a partition. Pwede siyang partition, division ng dalawang kwarto na magkaharap. Pwede mong sa gitna ng malaking kwarto na yun, pwede kang maglagay doon ng partition na gagamitan mo ng drywall. Okay. It can be removed and installed easily and can be cut in all sizes. So, dali niyang i-install sa isang bahay. So, pag magpatayo kayo ng bahay later on, marirecognize nyo yung mga ba't ibang uri ng mga materials for construction na kailangang i-check ng building official. Next, we have the Certificate of Occupancy. A certificate of occupancy is often required when you purchase a property. There are certain requirements you need to follow when you purchase a property. But if you do not pass inspection, hindi ka pumasa. So you must have the obtaining a certificate of occupancy that will serve as proof that the building has conformed to all housing and building codes. So yan yung patunay na pumasa yung bahay mo or yung establishment mo or yung commercial establishment mo sa building codes. Sumunod siya sa National Building Codes ng Pilipinas. So, pwede na siyang gamitin or pwede siyang tirhan or pwede na siyang gamitin for your business, no? Okay.
So why do we need a building permit? It is simply in compliance with the proper construction of house or a building following the requirements set by law or the National Building Code. Of course, you want to make sure all the proper technical, mechanical, electrical, and structural plans for construction of the building are met. In addition, if you build a house or a building without a permit from your municipality, construction will be stopped until a permit has been issued or released. You will receive a strict notice to apply for a permit. That is the main reason why we need a building permit. And the objective of building permit is to make sure that your building or house is safe in terms of occupancy and operation and can withstand the forces of nature like earthquake, flood, tsunami, storm surge, and other natural forces. Generally, there are three main elements that are considered in the exposure of a community to hazard. We have the physical elements, socioeconomic elements, and environmental elements. So, disaster is a phenomenon that can cause damage in physical elements. These are the elements that are tangible or can be visually seen. For examples are landscapes, inhabitants, buildings, and other structures that make up the environment. Some are measurable, such as population density. So, disaster is a phenomenon that can cause damage to physical elements, such as buildings, infrastructures, including people, and their properties. Therefore, we can say that physical elements are the most visible and quantifiable effects of disasters. During a hazard event, these physical elements that are exposed to the hazard may be altered or entirely destroyed. Flash floods can scrape off the topsoil, leaving it flat and barren in the aftermath. Another example is the decrease of population density from a high fatality rate resulting from devastating earthquake. So as you can see in our image, the location of the buildings are near the hazardous cliff or valley. So in terms of physical elements, it can change the previous structure of a soil or surroundings. No? It can the soil can be eroded or deformation may occur. And another example is the decrease of population density, which is means the large amount of deaths during earthquake. For example, the earthquake has a magnitude of 7.2, meaning that results to a large number of deaths. Next, we have socio-economic elements. So these comprise the institutional and government systems that dictate the kind of well-being and lifestyle of communities. All this can be altered, enhanced, or even questioned when exposed to hazards. In general, socio-economic elements refer to the manner of social interaction and not individuals or structures that are involved in the system. For example, socio-economic elements exposed to flooding and storm surge hazards include systems of communication and transportation delivery of basic facilities, goods and services, network of market and trade, stability of fishing industries, and other livelihoods dependent on aquatic resources and peace and order. Like any other disaster, these socio-economic elements may receive similar critical effects due to disruption of normal processes and activities. Okay, so this explains that we can determine the low-income households in terms of socio-economic elements that can depend fully on natural resources for their livelihood and are exposed to more frequent disasters and most vulnerable to financial losses. So, meaning poverty is the biggest reason why the socio-economic elements are being the most reason in hazard or exposing to hazards. We have the environmental elements. This includes the ecosystem and the natural processes that are exposed to hazard event. Organisms, samples are humans, animals, and plants, depend on the environment for survival. Human activities such as overgrazing, deforestation, and exploitation of natural resources strip the environment of its natural abilities to protect itself from any natural hazard. The absence or reduced number of trees, for example, may aggravate landslides and or flash floods. The aftermath of these hazards events may be difficult or even impossible to reverse. Okay, so to reduce the hazard event in accordance to environmental elements, the people and the government should reinforce projects like reforestation, for example. It is the reforestation that will help to prevent drought, landslides, or flood, or even storm surge. For example, in our image, the Bakhawan Eco Park as a mangrove reforestation project in Kalibo, Aklan, in order to prevent flood and storm surge in the community in New Buswang, Kalibo, Aklan. Hazards are possible threats that may come unexpectedly or otherwise. A hazard can lead to a disaster in a community. If the community is exposed to it, the community's circumstance or situation make it vulnerable to the hazard. These two determinants of disaster risk may be controlled in order to minimize or prevent the disaster. The combination of exposures and vulnerability determines the level of disaster that a community will most likely experience. This, along with high exposure and high vulnerability, can cause extreme disaster even if the hazard is deemed as a small scale. Okay, so this explains that the occurrence of disaster depends on two factors: hazards, the probability of occurrence of a potential damaging phenomenon, and vulnerability, the degree of loss resulting from the occurrence of the phenomenon. So we have the figure or schematic diagram of hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and elements at risk. So this figure here, or an example of schematic diagram in our slide, helps us to properly assess connection of hazards, exposures, and vulnerability depending on a given situation. Okay, so to illustrate the relationship of our given figure, so let us take, for example, a coastal community that is frequented by storms. Meaning, yung coastal community na yan, yung area na malapit sa dagat ay parating nasasalanta ng bagyo o yung storm surge na tinatawag. This would probably mean that the community is located within the typhoon belt, or that compared with other communities, it receives more rain and typhoons in a year. If that community has high exposure to a typhoon and is deemed to high vulnerability to the same hazard, it is more likely to experience disaster. Study the following table for some key questions regarding to the elements that are exposed to hazard. For our table, it simply means that physical, socio-economic, and environmental elements are the agents of vulnerability that can enhance or reduce communities' exposure to hazard. The given table also illustrate the availability of every element based on a given place and situation. So given a coastal community's high exposure to typhoons in our previous table, let us now assess its level of vulnerability. So in terms of proximity to disaster, if the community is directly and frequently hit by the typhoon, then its vulnerability to disaster associated with them is high. The fact that the community is located in a coastal area makes it more vulnerable because it will experience two hazards, the typhoons and storm surge. So in our analysis, it states that coastal areas are commonly experienced the most affected area in terms of typhoon and storm surge destructions, so the government should conduct early mitigation, preparedness, and awareness in the evacuation for them. Initiative from the community also plays a big role or a big help in cooperating to government rescue team. In that way, we can integrally eliminate high percentage of vulnerability. In terms of population density, if the community has a large number of population in exposed areas, the impact of the hazards will be more severe. In a community with a large population size, most members would not be well sheltered, making them become more vulnerable to hazards. The hazards can also lead to outbreaks of infectious diseases. Disease outbreaks may result from overcrowded evacuation with limited access to food and water. So in our analysis, it defines that population density also plays a big part in making community more vulnerable to disaster because not all people in that area are immediately cooperating. On the other hand, government should conduct proper evacuation area as early as possible in hygienic place with enough shelter. Good governance and leadership should also be implemented to reduce the risk of disaster and outbreaks. So in terms of capacity and efficiency to minimize disaster risk, if the community does not have any community disaster preparedness plans in place, it becomes more difficult to face the hazard without expecting any disaster. Lack of knowledge and practice of disaster management is like going to a battle unarmed. Hence, the community has a high vulnerability to disaster. So it means to say that the community and the emergency response rescue operation of the government should cooperate with one another in order to develop capacity and efficiency to minimize disaster risk as much as possible. Okay, we have building codes and disaster policies. So in terms of building codes and disaster policies, houses built on coastal areas are usually made of light materials. If a typhoon hits the community, a large number of houses may be unroofed. The location should be built at certain distance away from the shore, considering intrusion of water during high tide and storm surge. Considering all this together can help community assess its level of exposure and vulnerability to a particular hazard. So this explains that if all houses and other infrastructures near coastal areas follows the building codes requirements of the country or of the Philippines and also conducted by the government, the level of exposure and vulnerability will be lessened, making all houses more resilient to flood, storm surge, and even earthquakes.